All right, everybody. It is just about noon, and we are ready to get started on our final session of the lunch break series on hardwoods. I've really enjoyed this week, so thank you all for tuning in. And I have some opportunities at the end to talk about upcoming events as well, including future lunch break series. But for now, just as a reminder, please make sure that you set your to setting in your chat box to everyone so they can all see your questions. And also a reminder that this is being recorded, and I will send those links out sometime probably early next week, along with all kinds of resources that we've talked about over the week. I have a long list now of resources and links and organizations to plug you into at the end. So it'll be a pretty dense email to look forward to. All right, so today we are talking about Oregon ash, Fraxinus latifolia. So this is definitely our only ash species, our only native ash species in Washington, similar to the Oregon oak. It's our only native oak. We don't have a lot of ash to pick from in this area, but this one is pretty special. We'll talk about why. It's in the Oleaceae family, which, fun fact, is the same family as olive trees. In terms of form, it is about 60 to 80 feet tall. I couldn't find any information on the tallest or largest, what have you, recorded ash tree in the Pacific Northwest. So if anyone else is aware, please feel free to plug that in the chat. But this is sort of general numbers on how it grows. 16 to 30 inches in diameter. I've certainly seen them bigger than that, and about a 50-foot crown spread. It lives longer than red alder, about probably the same age as like a big leaf maple, not quite as long lived as the oak that we talked about yesterday, so about 250 years. Some notable features that we'll dig into over the next 20 or so minutes. It is a very critical wetland species. This is another niche species that grows on special sites, wetland sites, and can be very dominant in those settings. So on the right here, you see one of those sites where ash is really the dominant canopy. So not a ton of people actually have Oregon ash. Landowners in Washington, but when you do, you tend to kind of have a lot of it. You tend to have a dominant species, crown, or a crown dominated by ash if you have the right setting. So in terms of identification, this is important. So the leaves on ash trees are compound and pinnate. By compound, they mean that actually instead of each one of these leaves being the leaf, it's all the leaf. All of these are a leaf, and these individual leaves are called leaflets. So Oregon ash has 5 to 9 leaflets on a single leaf, this whole thing being the leaf. And those leaflets are ovate. They're mildly or lightly serrated as well, and about 2 to 4 inches long. But the actual leaf itself is a little bit longer, 4 to 13 inches long, depending on the location on the tree and size of the tree, that kind of thing. So one thing I always like to tell people is easy to identify Oregon ash is, one, it's oppositely arranged. So not a lot of tree species really, the only two species that really grow into large trees in Washington that have opposite arrangement are maples and the ash. And the way to tell ash from maple, well, besides in the summer when the leaf is obvious, in the winter, the buds of ash kind of look like chocolate chips. That's how I always remember them. In forestry school, we had to learn how to winter ID all kinds of trees, and you're always looking at the buds and the shape of the buds, obviously their arrangement too. But ash has little chocolate chip looking buds. Whereas maple has, I should have put a picture up, it has a bud that looks kind of like a crown, like a king's crown. Oops, went a little too far. So in terms of bark, obviously when it's young, it's a little smoother. It doesn't look, it's not fully formed, but as it gets older, it develops this sort of diamond-like pattern. You can see it's relatively deeply grooved, and you can see these little diamond-like shapes kind of throughout the bark. And if you stare at trees long enough, like I do, you start to be able to recognize that pretty easily. So I don't have any pictures of the flowers here, but they flower in mid-spring, and they develop into single-winged samaras, which, if you'll remember, maples also grow into single-winged samara, or double-winged samaras rather. But they have the same type of fruit, which is interesting. In terms of habitat, it will grow from California all the way up to Southwest Washington. Oregon ash really doesn't extend very far up north in Washington. You won't see it really in North Puget Sound too often, at least. And it really loves, again, those wet, poorly drained soils, those seasonally flooded areas, what we would call a forested wetland. So again, in Washington, typically restricted to southwestern region, and find a lot of it in the Chehalis Valley and in the northern Willamette Valley and out in Clark County. So this is its broad range, again, thinking more specifically about where you find it in sort of this area in the Chehalis Valley, and then down here in Clark County. So it produces seed around 30 years old, so it's a little late in life. And this is the only tree we've discussed so far that is dioecious, meaning that it has separate male and female trees. So you might have a tree that never produces any seed, and it's likely a male. And I have a stand of ash here on the property that I help manage for WSU that I think is about 70% males, it seems like, because I see hardly any seed from these trees over the last several years. So the small greenish flowers here, as I said, they appear in April and May, and they're largely wind pollinated. They're really not important pollinator species. And they ripen into these oblong samaras that we discussed. So it's a single wing samara. So if you think about the helicopter seeds for maples, they come in pairs usually, and these are always coming in singles. And they look a little different than the traditional maple seeds as well. And they often have heavy seed crops every 3 to 5 years, and then dispersing by wind throughout the fall and the winter. And again, like most hardwoods, it is capable of reproducing vegetatively. If you were to cut it down or damage it in some way, it's probably going to start sprouting from the base. As I said, it's a very niche species. It's able to grow in conditions that most other species cannot. Conditions like what you see here, very, very wet, flooded for long periods of time in the winter. And it can grow on drier sites than this, but this is kind of the far end of the spectrum of where it will grow. And almost no other species can really grow in situations like this, except maybe willow. Once it gets a little drier, that's when you might get things like cottonwood, or even Oregon oak can handle some of that seasonal flooding. We talked about that yesterday. But Oregon ash is one that really likes to sit in the water, or at least it can handle it in ways that other trees can't. It is moderately shade intolerant. Seedlings can establish in shade for a period, but they really need a canopy gap in order to recruit. And it's relatively slow growth compared to alder and maple, but certainly not as slow as oak. And we talked about how slow oak grows yesterday. Shallow and very wide spreading roots. This is often because of the nature of the soils that it occurs on. Soils with a high or restrictive layer, often not very far down, maybe a clay pan that kind of forces those roots to go shallow but wide spreading. And it's relatively, for that reason, relatively resistant to wind throw, as well as ice and snow. And the understories of these stands are often susceptible to reed canary grass, which is a noxious weed. I see a lot of Oregon ash stands with reed canary in the understory because especially slightly less dense stands that don't produce a lot of shade. So in terms of damage and disease, aside from one big exception, which we're going to talk about in the next few slides, it is relatively free of issues, or there are issues, but they really cause very little ecological or economic damage. So there's some weevils that affect the seeds, some fall webworm, which will affect The foliage as well, it does have its own bark beetle, but remember that in Western Washington, almost all bark beetles are secondary pests. They're really only taking down stressed trees. Similar to the maples that we talked about on Tuesday, they are susceptible to a powdery mildew fungus. Like all trees, it could get armillaria root rot as well. And then this is a leaf spot fungus that's really common, kind of like the tar spot that we discussed in maples. It's mostly an aesthetic problem. Really, it's not really affecting the long-term health of the tree. It tends to develop a little later in the season after the tree has really done most of its growth anyway. It can also be affected by mistletoe, and it is certainly affected by deer and elk browse. You need to protect your ash seedlings if you were to be planting them. So I want to talk about the big one here. A lot of people, in fact, someone asked about it right at Jason asked at the beginning of the presentation or before we started about emerald ash borer. And it is a kind of a big topic right now because this invasive beetle was found in Forest Grove. I believe that's where it was found, Forest Grove, Oregon, just outside of Portland last June. And it's a big deal because emerald ash borer is a particularly devastating insect to the Fraxinus genus. All trees in that genus are susceptible to, or at least in North America, are very susceptible to the emerald ash borer. And so I wanted to give a little bit of background about the insect, just a few slides on it before we get onto the other stuff about ash. So it was, as I said, it's invasive. It came from China, Southeast Asia area, where there it behaves as a completely secondary pest. It's not nearly as problematic as it is here. It was established in Detroit sometime in the mid to late 90s and then identified in 2001 or 2002, just outside of Detroit in Garden City, Michigan, about 30 minutes from where I grew up, actually. So as I said, it's very devastating to the Fraxinus genus in North America. It's capable of pretty significant mortality rates, up to 95% or even 100% in some areas. And certain species of ash are more susceptible to others. So you'll see higher mortality rates in different species, like white ash is particularly susceptible, whereas something like blue ash, these are East Coast species, is less susceptible. And Oregon ash is considered to be pretty susceptible. I mean, we don't really know quite yet what mortality rates we'll see. It's very early, but it's supposed to be in that sort of white ash, green ash range. So after being established in Michigan in 2002, it's since spread to 35 states and 5 provinces. It's considered the most devastating invasive insect in U.S. history. It's important to understand that in the eastern U.S., if you're not familiar with those forests, ash is much more common. There is a lot of ash there. It's pretty prevalent throughout the different forest types, and there's several different species of ash. So the scale of damage in the Pacific Northwest will not be nearly the same as it was there. That said, it is still something that we need to be concerned about. And also, it's important to note that there's a lot of ornamental ash in urban and landscape areas that can also be affected here. And really, that's where a lot of the financial or economic damage comes into play, is loss of trees in those urban settings. So this is the beetle, the emerald ash borer. It's in the buprestid family, which is the shiny metallic wood boring family. You can see it's a little bit bullet shaped. It's about a 1/2 inch long, skinny, metallic emerald green color. Sometimes it has hints of copper. And there are a lot of lookalikes. And it's kind of difficult to tell it apart from other lookalikes. This is a publication from the Oregon Department of Ag that I really like. And it shows just all these other beetles that are some in the buprestid family, others not, but they're green. And could easily be mistaken for emerald ash borer. So, as this kind of rolls out, it hasn't been identified in Washington yet, but it is really, frankly, a matter of time. It will be important that folks like you all that are on the ground be aware and be aware of the resources available to help you identify something if you're concerned. So, more resources to come on that as this rolls out, but understand that you're not necessarily responsible for being an entomologist and identifying this thing yourself. But I haven't mentioned yet what it does to a tree is it bores below the bark and it feeds on the phloem and the cambium. And well, I guess I should say it lays eggs that hatch and then bore into the bark and feed on the phloem and cambium. So it's sort of like a bark beetle in that sense. And ultimately, that's what kills the tree is it being girdled by feeding on those interior layers that were really important for sugar transport and growth in the tree. So in terms of symptoms, just kind of speaking generally here, it's one of the first things you would see would be canopy dieback, and it's typically top-down damage because the beetle starts at the top of the tree and works its way down, which is quite unique, and also makes it very difficult to identify early because not a lot of people are hanging out in the tops of their trees, and it takes a little while for that canopy dieback to surface. Epicormic branching or sprouting like this is also a potential sign of emerald ash borer, although it is important to note that can be a sign of other things as well, like physical damage or even drought damage can surface as epicormic branching. This is a stress response from a tree that is experiencing damage to its crown and is trying to rebuild it. It is not a common or normal strategy for a tree to rebuild its canopy from below, but that's why this is considered a stress response. So as the symptoms advanced, you would start to see bark splitting, and underneath that, you would start to see these serpentine larval galleries. This is the larvae feeding, and it has this very S-shaped gallery that kind of winds through, and it usually gets bigger from one end to the other as the larvae is growing. You could also see some increased woodpecker activity because of that. But really, one of the best ways to identify emerald ash borer is this D-shaped exit hole. And unfortunately, by the time you're seeing this, it's much too late to do anything about it. But that flat on one side and a half circle on the other just looks exactly like a D. And that is very unique to emerald ash borers. It's a very strong sign that it might be present. So just thinking about the potential impacts in Washington, yes, at scale, it will not necessarily be as big of an issue as it was in the eastern part of the country, just thinking about the damage to the forest sector there in particular, but there will certainly be ecological ramifications of this, as well as ramifications in those urban spaces. Like we talked about, loss of urban canopy can cause issues with urban heat bubbles and stormwater mitigation, increased presence of hazard trees and all the costs associated with removing them or the potential injury or damage that they can cause, not to mention the reduced property value. When you remove a tree from your yard, your property actually often loses value. So that's something to think about. And the disproportionate effects it can have on low income communities that maybe can't pay, often $1,000 or even a few $1,000s to have a tree removed that's close to a home. And then the cost of ash treatment, which you can treat urban trees and you can treat them long term. And they're actually, different forms of treatment are very effective at preventing emerald ash borer, but there is an ongoing cost there associated with that. And then in forest settings, we think more about the ecological ramifications, increased temperatures in riparian areas due to canopy loss of soil stabilization. Sorry about that. Due to just, again, loss of trees, loss of tree rooting, changes in hydrology, because all the transpiration that trees provide. And then, of course, you run the risk of establishing more noxious weeds in the absence of that tree canopy. So what can landowners do? The first and foremost, don't move firewood. Don't move ash firewood in particular. I personally think in general it's a good idea to not really be moving firewood long distances, just never really knowing what kind of pests we might be spreading. But certainly don't move ash firewood. That's how emerald ash borer really spread so fast, so quickly, was through the movement of ash firewood. So that's the first thing you can do. They say buy it where you burn it, which I think is a really great way to support your local small forest owner who might have a roadside firewood stand. So if you're going camping, go out there and buy it within a few miles of wherever you're camping, and everybody wins. I would say also to stay up to date. This is relatively fresh. We're learning a lot and kind of understanding a best way to respond, and more resources, including extension resources like fact sheets and stuff, are going to be available in the time to come. If you own ash, obviously watching for the signs and symptoms is important. And then if you think you see it, take pictures or capture a sample, and try to get it to a professional for help identifying that. But again, right now, as far as we know, it's only in Forest Grove, Oregon. Obviously, that is very close to the Washington border. So it's very possible it could be in the southwest part of Washington. But as far as we know right now, it's limited to Forest Grove. So back to this sort of ecological role of ash. As we said, it can be a long-term dominant and climax species on these poorly drained areas. Thinking of this areas with slow-moving streams, floodplains, heavy clay soils, sites that can't sustain other trees, including even cottonwood. Like we mentioned, cottonwood is definitely associated with poorly drained sites, but ash can go even a little bit further than cottonwood. It can grow on sites where maybe even cottonwood doesn't like that. So again, on slightly drier sites, though, it can be a component of mixed stands. So this is a stand down in Richfield, and a landowner I know there has got quite a bit of ash, and the stand is probably about 50% ash, but the rest is a mix of cottonwood you see here. There's some Oregon oak mixed in there, and this is really interesting to me. This is Western white pine that they planted, and it just happened to do pretty well. It seems to be doing really well, and I never known Western white pine to be a species that can handle these kind of sites. But other associated species, including understory species, might be willow, red alder on where it gets a little bit drier, right? It's kind of a spectrum moving up from where it's super dry or super saturated and super poorly drained. Moving upland, you might see a little more red alder, maybe some big leaf maple. And the understory species like snowberry and rose do well on these sites. And there is going to be some research soon getting into place looking at possible replacement species on a gradient of Oregon ash sites. So it's really good that that's going to get started soon, so that we can have recommendations for what landowners can plant back and possibly start diversifying their ash stands with ahead of the emerald ash borer. So in terms of importance to wildlife, one of the things that makes it important is that it's often providing critical habitat in these bottomlands and valleys that have been converted to agriculture, where agriculture can really dominate. They can provide very valuable wildlife corridors. So deer and elk do, of course, browse on the foliage. Because they're riparian species, beaver will use them. The foliage are consumed by a number of butterfly larvae. And I know seeds, that several birds will feed on the seeds. And I believe this is a spotted towhee. I know Ken Bevis is on the line. Maybe he can confirm me. I don't know my birds terribly well. So there is certainly some wildlife value here, but a lot of it stemming from just its placement in the sort of overall ecosystem, including the human ecosystem. All right. Oops, backwards here. In terms of indigenous people's use of ash, there's less known about it here, but in the eastern part of the country, ash species are incredibly sacred. And it's one of the more devastating parts of emerald ash borer is the loss of this very culturally important species to many tribes, especially in the upper Great Lakes, where they used ash for basket weaving. In the western area, Oregon ash was often used, as a source of wood for small tools and instruments and things like that. But it was also used for canoe paddles. It's also considered a paddle tree in some areas, similar to how maple was called the paddle tree. So the roots could often be used to make baskets, infusions of the twigs used for fevers, mashed roots used to treat wounds. And I just want to point out, I've all of what I've gathered this week on the Native American uses of these different species is from this database. And so I just want to plug it really quickly. It's was a very interesting thing to dig into, and I really encourage you all to do the same. In terms of uses and products, there's not really a significant economic or timber market for Oregon ash. Certainly, it is harvested at times and used, but it's not an incredibly valuable species in this region, which is one of the reasons the scope of economic damage from emerald ash borer probably won't be as significant. So it is, relatively machinable, moderately hard, heavy wood. So it can be used for flooring, furniture, cabinets, things like that. Interestingly, it was the #1 species for baseball bats for a very long time, and really still is the preferred one. There was a really good New York Times article a while back about how emerald ash borer the impacts of emerald ash borer on the game of baseball. So if I can find that, I'll add that to the email. But I thought that was really, really interesting. But it does make great firewood, but just a reminder, really get into that habit of not moving that firewood. That's the best thing we can do right now to avoid spreading emerald ash borer. One thing too to consider, it is subject to riparian zone restrictions. Is one of the reasons that it's probably not harvested terribly often. So, I hesitated to even put this slide in because really planting ash right now would not be very much recommended considering the presence of emerald ash borer. We want to plant species that we know are going to survive it. And I want to point out too that even though, with the presence of the AB, I don't want it to seem like we're just, ash is a goner and we're not going to be, it's going to go extinct or something in the Pacific Northwest. I don't believe that personally. I don't know any other foresters that believe that, but for the time being, we're not really recommending planting it until we can sort of discover genetic resistance or come up with strategies to create sort of and allow enough time basically for an equilibrium to occur between emerald ash borer and our native ash species until it can basically become naturalized. So, again, not really recommending planting ash right now, but a few notes here on what would be necessary to do it. Again, seedlings, like many of the species we've talked about, are not commonly sold, but it can be collected on your own. All right, so if you do have an ash stand, though, there is something to be said for continuing to manage it. Obviously, thinning in young stands and even in older stands can help maintain vigor, and it's certainly going to help it towards all those other pests that we listed, although it may not do much to help prevent emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is just particularly devastating and can take down even vigorous trees. But that said, I think it's still worthwhile to do our best to maintain vigorous growth in our ash stands. There is something called SLAM management for emerald ash borer, which I don't have any time to get into today, but it's this concept it stands for slowing ash mortality. And this is a form of management in ash stands that combines things like biocontrols, trap trees, stand management, and possibly insecticides as well to slow the mortality of ash, buying us time to sort of replace the species as emerald ash borer works its way through. And I mentioned the possibility of diversifying stands with underplanting and small openings. So again, more to come on that as some of that research unfolds and recommendations for replacement species here. So I want to talk about, I guess I want to talk about how I wish I could talk about other Washington hardwoods here. I've only talked about 4, and here are 4 more, but that's not even really the end of the list. There's, just thinking off the top of my head, aspen, willow, and then in the understory, you got species like vine maple, cascara, dogwood, which all be considered hardwoods. So I couldn't get into all of them today. Unfortunately, maybe we can do a series on even lesser known hardwoods eventually. But just want to point out that there are certainly more than what we talked about this week. Slides aren't moving here. There we go. And I just want to say thank you all for tuning in this week. I hope you enjoyed it. And I want to point out that we're going to be doing another series of forestry lunch breaks in January, I believe starting January 9th. And that's going to be on birds of Washington. And our very own Ken Bevis, who was on yesterday and I believe is on today still, will be helping out with that, along with several other foresters and wildlife biologists from the DNR. So I would encourage you to go to forestry.wcu.edu to sign up for that. And I also want to point out, I still have some spots left in an upcoming forest stewardship coach planning course. If you're not familiar, this is an 8-week course that helps landowners develop forest stewardship plans. You get a site visit from a forester as a part of that. It's really great. In the course, you learn a lot. And I also want to ask that everybody take a minute to fill out a survey, which I'm going to put in the chat box really quickly. So I just put that in the chat box. I really encourage you all to fill that survey out. I'll also send that out in the email. It helps me tremendously to know what you think of these programs, how effective they are, whether or not you're going to use any of what we learned today and in your management if you are a landowner. But also, it really helps me to know what topics you'd like to see covered in future lunch breaks. So there is a question there for that, and I really encourage you to let me know if you have any other ideas for lunch series. It makes my job easier, not having to guess what you all want to hear about. All right, so with that, I will stop and then look at the chat box for some questions. And I understand if people need to drop off, by all means, please do if you've got something else to do, and I will send you the recording. All right, looking back at the top here. Yeah, someone asked about a session on cottonwood. Like I said, I would love to have been able to cover all the species, and I would have added a 5th day today, but unfortunately I couldn't do tomorrow. So yeah, maybe a future session on even lesser known hardwoods. I personally really love cottonwood. A lot of people don't like it, but cottonwood and the populus genus in general is among my favorites. All right, so Emily says, nurseries are still selling Fraxinus. Do you think that there will be some regulation regarding nursery production? There is definitely a possibility for quarantine. And, I imagine at some point the market for some Fraxinus species may just kind of go down. I believe in Oregon, they are working on a quarantine for that Forest Grove area, not bringing any of the products out of that region, not any ash products out of there. But I have no sense of whether there's any thoughts about doing that in Washington right now. It's, to some degree, we're learning from the Eastern US, and they did a lot of quarantines there, and well, you saw how that went. So there's some conversation about how the efficacy of those regulations in general. So that was kind of a non-answer, but I gave it my best shot there. So Alan mentions I have 5 green ash. They are established and about 5 years old. The aphids are prolific on the terminal buds at bud break and very stunting to the spring growth. That's interesting. I've been using a systemic insecticide to successfully control these aphids, but I think there may be a trade-off as it appears the insecticide may be stunting the spring growth. I'm using the insect and not over applying. Okay. Yeah, I wish I could help you more here, but I'm just not that familiar with the effects of insecticide on growth. I have never heard anything about a systemic insecticide affecting growth. And in theory, I don't know how it would. But again, I'm not an expert on that. My general thoughts are it is better to have a live, slow growing tree than an unalive tree, in general. And I will say too that, in light of emerald ash borer, when the time comes, I don't know where you are, Alan, a lot of the treatments for that are also systemic insecticides. And actually, I think it is. I'm not licensed to really talk about those, so I won't go in any further. But it will be required, I guess, in order to keep those trees alive. So you'll have to make that decision yourself about whether or not it's worth it. But I can't really speak to the effects it would have on growth. So Wendy asked, is there a taxonomic link between mountain ash and Oregon ash? No, there is not, which is good news. So those of you that have mountain ash is not related. So it is not in the Fraxinus species and is unaffected by emerald ash borer. On a slight side note, those of you that have olive trees, because Oleaceae is the same family between Fraxinus and the olive trees, emerald ash borer can have some effect on olives, but the damage is usually significantly less. So I don't know a lot of people that have olive trees in Washington, but it is something to be thinking about. All right, so Kayla asked, can you speak to the efforts underway to identify ash populations that may be genetically resistant to EAB-related mortality? Yeah, so the Forest Service has actually been working on this for some time, even ahead of emerald ash borer getting established in the area, looking for genetic resistance. In fact, the last 2 or 3 years, I had hosted a webinar for landowners that have ash interested in collecting seed and donating it to that research. And we were able to get a few people to provide Washington populations to that research. So that is still underway, and it will take time. And even in the eastern part of the country where they are finding genetic resistance and doing that, it's not going to be enough necessarily to stop the flow or stop the spread of emerald ash borer, but it is how we kind of hope to build back in a sense. So to answer your question, yes, it is underway, but certainly studies like that can take decades, frankly. So Emily mentions that study. Looks like someone asked about predators of emerald ash borer. So we don't have any natural predators of emerald ash borer in Washington, just it being a non-native species. I guess there may be some native species that are starting to predate on it, but it would not be enough. So what they have tried to do is the idea of biocontrols, which is introducing another non-native that is a predator of that insect, and they are working on that. I think they have 4 biocontrols that are being used in the eastern part of the country, and I believe they're talking about doing that in Oregon right now. The problem is it's not a catch-all solution by any means, because it takes too long for the predator populations to build up, and emerald ash borer just spreads so fast. It's just so vigorous that it's not really going to be a solution to stem the tide necessarily, but it is a part of the long-term solution of keeping ash and sort of naturalizing emerald ash borer. Would a possible place to plant for isolated stand be around Port Angeles, Washington? That is a good question. And again, this comes back to the nature of how ash behaves in the Pacific Northwest. It is different than in the eastern part of the country, where it's pretty much ubiquitous, right? Like the ash is just kind of everywhere. Certainly like some sites over others, but there's just so much of it. So there could very well be isolated stands of ash in Washington that are too far for the beetle to fly, and so they may be buffered for a very long time from the beetle until someone brought some firewood over or something. Again, my general recommendation would not be to plant ash right now, though. That's just my sort of broad recommendation. Just because you got to know, if there's another ash tree within 2 miles of you, the beetle could get there, or if somebody brings firewood. I just think there's probably better species to plant right now. Does emerald ash borer primarily affect older trees or younger ones as well? It can, from what I understand, attack younger trees. I want to say even trees just a couple inches. It's more about size, I think, than age. Can host the beetle. Nearly all paper birch and other birch trees are dying in Ridgefield, Washington area due to heat stress or of our recent summers. Steve, I can't speak to that without seeing them. Heat stress is not a bad guess. I can say that for sure. So many of our trees are struggling with that, but I can't speak to that without seeing them. Again, for site-specific questions, I really point people to our DNR service foresters. I know you're talking more about a broad area of Ridgefield, Steve, but I just want to reiterate how great of a resource that is. And those service foresters can come out to your property and help you with site-specific things. And thanks, Steve, for the recommendation on the coach planning course. I agree. I think it's a really great course, and people always kind of rave about it afterwards on how much they've learned. Craig mentioned, for diversity's sake, I'd like to plant a small grove of ash trees, 20-inch trees to go along with cottonwood and alder that I already have. Are you discouraging that, or can I go ahead? Or where can I get seed? My general recommendation would be to not plant ash right now. That's kind of what I'm sticking to. Just having grown up in Michigan and seeing the damage that ash can do, it would really suck to put all that work in just for the ash trees to not make it. But it is you're the landowner. You get to make the decision. And honestly, 20 trees, it's not that much, right? It's not like you're risking a whole lot. And certainly it could take I don't know where you are, but it could take a long time for emerald ash borer to get to you. So those trees could do a lot of good in the meantime. So there is an argument for that for sure. As far as where you can get seed, I'm really not sure. If you don't have ash already, I don't know where you could purchase that. You might be able to get seedlings at one of the native plant sales. And I'm thinking of the native plant nursery. The name is blank on me now, but I'm going to write a note to point you in that direction for the email to a couple nurseries. Sorry. It looks like Jason answered a little bit. If you wanted to collect seeds, you could come this summer to Mossy Rock and gather for free if you want. So that's always good to see landowners helping each other out. Yeah, so David mentioned ash cultivars in urban areas are likely to create a stepping stone for EAB to nearby forested areas. Yeah, so, and I didn't really get into the life cycle of the beetle, but generally speaking, a female can fly about 2 miles. That's what I understand. But again, between urban populations and natural populations, especially, say if Forest Grove, it gets started across the water on Ridgefield and just kind of going up the I-5 corridor from there is a lot of ash and it can spread quickly. So you'll see it spread through those corridors like that and sort of hopping between urban and natural populations. So thanks, Dave. That's a really good point. All right, so Emily asks, is your recommendation not to plant more about losing trees and the cost of effort loss, or to prevent a host pathway to areas where emerald ash borer has not been detected? I say it's more about the former than the latter. I think there's enough ash already to host a pathway, but certainly it's worth considering than not wanting to host that pathway any further. Chris said Storm Lake Growers sells ash seedlings. Plant Materials Center. Emily mentioned, yes, the plant. I'll send a link. It's completely blanking on what I'm trying to think of. They supply all the plant materials to the conservation districts. Yes, Nick, thank you. The Plant Materials Center in Bow. And maybe that's all it is. For some reason, I thought there was more to the name than Plant Materials Center, but that could be it. Looks like someone else posted a link. Inside Passage Seeds has seeds, and Emily posted the link to the Plant Materials Center. Awesome. So I think that's everything, and I can see the numbers getting really low. So unless there's any other questions, I'm going to sign off, but just really quickly plug the survey in the chat box again. Please take a couple minutes and let me know what you thought of the series and what else you would like to see. But otherwise, I will call it quits there. And I hope you all have great holidays.